So our next speaker will be John Gassman. He's the HMA branch chief. Maybe you can explain what HMA is. And he's in FEMA Region 7, and he's come to us from Kansas City. Thank you, John.
Hey, good morning, everyone. John Gassman. So HMA is Hazard Mitigation Assistance, which falls under the Mitigation Division in FEMA. So essentially, we manage some of the grants that help communities be more resilient. We are trying to solve problems before they happen. We want your communities and infrastructure to be resilient to the hazards that you will encounter rather than waiting for it to be damaged and then rebuilding it. Well, one thing that we like to say is that mitigation breaks the cycle of build, damage, rebuild. We want to break that cycle and make our communities and infrastructure more resilient. So I'll start off by saying I'll have a couple of this is like a hypothetical or a rhetorical question. So how many of you have had a thought like this? Boy, the next time we get a big rain, Main Street is going to flood. Or the next time we get a big snowstorm, we're going to lose power for 3 days. Or the folks in our town don't have a safe place to go the next time a tornado comes this way. I know that's on a lot of people's minds here in Iowa recently. So I'm sure that all of you, if not all, or most of you, if not all of you, have had similar thoughts over the years when it comes to the natural hazards that your communities face. So here's a follow-on question. How many of you have a plan in place to reduce the impact of those hazards on your communities? Okay, great. That's why I'm here. So some communities, you may not even know the hazards that you face, or what's let alone the best course of action to mitigate that hazard. Others may not know how to implement the actions that they've identified or how to pay for them. So I'm going to talk today, the purpose of my presentation is to help you answer some of those questions. So first off, what is hazard mitigation? You've got this is the FEMA definition up here, but it's basically what I said before. It's breaking that cycle of build, damage, rebuild. Another way to think about is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Spend some money up front to make your communities and infrastructure more resilient, and then when you encounter a natural hazard, you don't have as much damage. It doesn't take as long for your community to recover. Why do hazard mitigation? Well, two reasons. One, disasters are costly. So in 2022, there were 18 weather or climate disaster events with losses that exceeded $1 billion each. The annual average of billion-dollar disaster events for the last 5 years is 17.8. So so you see the disasters are extremely costly, and those costs are going up, and they're becoming more frequent. The other reason is mitigation saves. Like I said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. According to the National Institute of Building Sciences 2019 report called Natural Hazard Mitigation Saves, there are certain mitigation activities where you can see up to a 12-to-1 return on investment in avoided damages. On average, using federal grants for mitigation actions results on a 6-to-1 return on investment. So as I said, I work in hazard mitigation assistance grants. The three main ones that I will talk to you about today are the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, Flood Mitigation Assistance, and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. I'll go into a little more detail on each of these going forward. So I do want to say that for these programs, these are not accessible to individual citizens. So these are programs that if you are a government entity or a qualifying private nonprofit, you would apply through the state to access these funds. There are some facets of these programs that may be accessible to individuals, but they still will have to go through a governmental organization. So next I'll go through each one of these programs a little more in detail. Oh, so before I move on, I did just want to say, So the big thing with the infrastructure bills, IRA and IIJA, they both represented just really significant investments in mitigation. You can see here the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, the grant that I'll talk about first. The program that opened in the fall of 22, there's $2.3 billion available in mitigation funds across the U.S. $2 million per state that was allocated per state to use for what we call capability and capacity building, but also for mitigation projects. And then the rest of it was in a national competition. For the flood mitigation assistance, I believe that doubled. It was somewhere around $400 or $500 million in 2021, up to $800 million. That's more than has ever been in flood mitigation assistance in that grant program. So we just saw like a huge, significant investment in mitigation from those two bills. So let's talk about who's eligible for BRIC and FMA. So again, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities and Flood Mitigation Assistance. So there's two levels. There's applicants and sub-applicants. Applicants are going to be the state level agency. Here in Iowa, it's the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Department. Within that, there's the hazard mitigation folks. They will put together the state level application. They'll also put out the information to the counties and communities so that they can submit sub-applications. And you can see here there's some other information about eligibility, but again, the bottom line is for sub-applicants, it's those local governments, tribal governments, actually for this program, you cannot be a private nonprofit. One note for the flood mitigation assistance, it is tied to the National Flood Insurance Program. The purpose of FMA is to reduce the number of NFIP payouts, is really the bottom line. So it's investing in mitigating up front so there are fewer flood insurance claims down the road. So in order to apply for an FMA grant, your community has to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And then that project that you're submitting has to provide a benefit to NFIP insured structures. There we go. This is our main one, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. This becomes available after a presidentially declared disaster. There's a calculation that is done to figure out the amount of funds that are available. It's based on the amount of money that is spent in the disaster through public assistance, individual assistance. Fortunately, they do those calculations at headquarters. But one of the things an advantage that you all have here in Iowa is what we call an enhanced state. So what that means is essentially the folks at HSEMD have more capability than most states in the nation. Right now, there's only 15 enhanced states. Iowa is one of them. And so what that means is they actually get more available for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program than a standard state. So a standard state would get, you would figure out all of those costs from the disaster and then times 15%, and that's how much would be available for mitigation. In Iowa, it's 20%. So because your folks at HSEMD are so good, you get extra money to do mitigation following a disaster. The other thing with the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, it can be used statewide. So the state works with local communities to figure out the priorities and where they're going to spend that money. It does not have to be used just in those declared counties or the counties that were impacted by the disaster. It can be used anywhere. For this grant, there is a cost share. Generally, it's 75% federal and 25% non-federal. Again, another big advantage you have here in Iowa is that there is a state level. The state covers part of that non-federal share. So the state will cover half of that non-federal share, or 12.5% of your overall project. So that's another huge advantage here in Iowa. Sorry, backing up quickly, talking about cost share. So for BRIC and FMA, these are annual grants. They come out in the fall. So the last one was, it came out in September of 22. The application window closed at the end of January. Those applications are currently under review at the national level. We are, fingers crossed, looking for awards to start maybe in May, more likely, later on this summer. For the cost share on these grants, again, they're generally 75-25, but there are some caveats. So for BRIC, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant, if you are what FEMA calls an economically disadvantaged rural community, you would qualify for an enhanced cost share, which would cover up to 90% of your project. So economically disadvantaged rural communities are communities that are less than 3,000 people, and the average per capita income is less than 80% of the national average. I will tell you that there are a lot of communities in Region 7 that meet this criteria. So if you are looking for a project to make your community more resilient, this is another incentive for you. You may qualify for an enhanced cost share under BRIC. For flood mitigation assistance, if you are mitigating structures that are qualified as repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss under the NFIP, the cost share for repetitive loss is up to 90%, and for some severe repetitive loss, it's 100%. So if you have structures, homes that have been repetitively flooded, they continue to put in flood insurance claims, you may qualify for up to 100% of the cost of acquiring that structure and relocating it or demolishing it from the federal government. All right, and then so here are some of the eligible activities. They kind of fall into two big buckets. I know this is pretty small, but what you'll see is that there's what we call capability and capacity building, right? And that's the things that sort of happen at the at the governmental level. It's helping the either like state agency or a local government to build their capacity and their capability to deal with hazards. So that includes things like plans, what we call project scoping, the technical assistance, but also building codes. There's a real big push under BRIC for building codes at the state level, but really at the local level. There's additional money now available under HMGP for building codes as well, if your community needs help figuring out how to incorporate or enforce building codes. And then we have the mitigation projects. So that's going to cover some of the big ones that folks have heard of, what we call property acquisition. Those are sometimes called flood buyouts. It's where the local government will purchase a flood-prone property or a flood-damaged property, either relocate the structure out of that area, or demolish it, and then the property is returned to green space. It's basically returned to the floodplain, and then it's held in perpetuity. It cannot be built on ever again. So there are some other things here, and I won't go through each one of them, but just to kind of give you an idea. And then for the the Inflation Reduction Act, there is one section that does really impact these grants, and that has to do with low carbon materials. So the federal government saw that one of the barriers to communities using low carbon materials when they're doing construction was the cost. And so for these grants, if you want to use low carbon materials in your construction, and that could be things from culverts or whatever, you can use those materials even though they cost more, and you would get reimbursed for them. So that's additional money that's available through the IRA. So with that, this is my boss, Kathy Sanders. She's our Mitigation Division Director. But your best point of contact here in the state is going to be at HSEMD. Dusty Bagones is the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, the folks that we affectionately refer to as SHMOs. And this is their group email. It's the hsemdmitigation@iowa.gov. So if you have questions, by all means, please stop by, see me next door. But also, other resources that are available to you, your local emergency managers, county emergency managers, folks like that, and then folks at the state level. So thank you very much for your time.